Twin flames in a different life. Deep connection lights a spark. It's like you know me in the depths of my heart. We're dreamers. Don't care what other people say. We live it like this could be our final day. We're dreamers. Don't care what the others say. We're doing this in our way. We come alive in the nighttime. There's something about how we dance in the moonlight. That look in your eyes, it tells me that you want me and all my loving. We come alive in the nighttime. You and I, we come alive. We come alive. We come alive. What's your weakness? What's your type? Somehow I wanna know all about you. Deep connection lights a spark. You already know me when we dance in the dark. We're dreamers. Don't care what other people say. We live it like this could be our final day. We're dreamers. Don't care what the others say. We're doing this in our way. We come alive in the nighttime. There's something about how we dance in the moonlight. That look in your eyes, it tells me that you want me and all my loving. We come alive in the nighttime. You and I, we come alive. We come alive. We come Tell me that you want me. I can see you want me by the look in your eyes. Tell me that you want me. I can see you want me by the look in your eyes. We come alive. We come alive. We come alive in the nighttime. There's something about how we dance in the moonlight. That look in your eyes, it tells me that you want me and all my loving. We come alive in the nighttime. You and I, we come alive. We come alive. We come alive.
Well, hello everyone and welcome. I'm Gordon and I am really glad to be here. It's session number 2. I hope everybody is having a great day and everything's going well for you. It's just after 11 o'clock, so I'm going to get started right away. We've got a great session cooking here and I hope you will get a lot out of this. So we're going to jump right in. I should be able to see comments today. The tech is working. I'm happy about that. Hi, Diana, on watching on YouTube. Looks like a couple of people watching on Facebook, and maybe even a couple of people watching on the directory page. Awesome, awesome. If you're watching on the replay, welcome to you as well. And unfortunately, we don't have a way for you to comment. I'm going to fix that as soon as I can. But anyway, let's just jump right in. I've got a fun presentation for you today. We're going to be covering the 4 hallmarks, the hallmarks of professionalism in podcasting and really in any business. And there are sort of 4 major hallmarks, but just to quickly review, let me go to the slides here. That's not the right slide screen. Hold on. Hold the phone. Let's get it going here. Got to find the right, what is happening here? There we go. Now we're showing the keynote slides, right? But hold on. It's interesting. It shows it correctly here. Oh, wait a minute. Let me see if I can figure out what's happening here. There we go. I'm going to put this here. Switch this to here. And now it's showing you the wrong screen. So I have to bear with me, folks. I thought I spoke too soon. The tech side is not working as I'd hoped. So let me make this work here. Keynote to the correct. That's the wrong display. Here we go. Bang. But it's not showing you what it needs to be showing you. Oh, come on. Stand by while I figured this out one more second. I hate when this happens while everything was working beautifully a minute ago. Zoom to the app window. Okay, there we go. Now, okay, now it's working. All right. Hi again, everybody, and welcome to session number 2 of our live Get Legit Go Pro in podcasting training and workshop. And today we're going to be talking about the hallmarks of professionalism in podcasting, or really in any other business. And to get us started, I'm just going to start off with a little bit of review from what we covered in session number 1. You remember I say that if you are going to be a professional, you need to think legit. We got work on that thinking, that mindset, that vision crafting, so that we know how we're going to get where we're going to go. And we're going to act and operate as the professional because we have envisioned, we visualized what being a legit pro means. Next, we're going to also have to plan legit. And in our last session, we talked a little bit about the planning process, sort of a business plan strategy. Even if you're not in it to make money, even if you don't think of your podcasting as a business, I think it's a great idea to be business-like in your approach. And that means thinking and planning for your future. And then we talk briefly about what it means to behave legit. So you have to think legit, you have to plan legit, and you have to behave legit, act legit, do the things that professionals do. And that means having structures in place. And that's what we're here to talk about today, the structures. What kinds of structures? Well, these are the things that we're going to talk about. These structures and strategies really are the hallmarks of professionalism, certainly in podcasting, but really in any kind of a business. Now, I am just going to take one moment to double check, okay, just making sure my sound is good. So here's what I'm talking about. We're going to talk about your legit business structure. That is the organizational component that underlies everything else. We'll talk about your legit team structure. This affects who owns what and how things get done in your business. We'll talk about your legit intellectual property strategy. Your most important assets in your business are likely to be the intellectual property. Protecting yours and respecting the intellectual property of others is crucial, that you have a clear understanding and systems and strategies in place for making that happen. So, and then finally, we'll be talking about your legit intellectual property, your legit client and customer strategy. This is where the rubber really meets the road. It's where the money is, but it also impacts your reputation, your standing, and the kind of respect that you command from the outside world. So, oops, something changed and I blew it. Go back to the slides. Turn this thing off real quickly here. All right. So, let's focus on your legit business structure. Oh, gosh. Focusing on your legit business structure, your entity selection. Plan and act and behave like a professional. All right. Now, as I said, I want everybody to know who remembers the big takeaway that I wanted you to have from first session. It is this. Here it is. Who can fill in those blanks? Karen's got it. It's a dual monitor issue with Keynote. Exactly right. That's not the answer to this. But I use dual monitors all the time, and this is something's happening that's different. So in any event, here are the big takeaway. Whether you're in it as a hobby or a side hustle or as your main gig, getting your business and legal affairs in order is the best way to feel confident and secure so you can grow, monetize, and supercharge your podcasting operation and go forward for big success. Until you do, you will be at risk of getting taken advantage of losing control of your podcast and business, of losing money, missing out on opportunities, of spending too much, or staying right where you are now and just hoping for that magic pill. And you're at risk of continuing to play small. I want you to play the bigger game the way professionals play. And to do that, you have to think, plan, and act like a professional. So let's get started talking about your legit business structure. We'll start right out the bat with your business entity. What is a business entity? Well, a business entity is an organization that's formed for the purposes of conducting business activities. It becomes an umbrella. It becomes a protective structure. It becomes an organizational structure, as you'll see. Now, sometimes organizational entities, business entities, are formed by the overt actions of the business's founders. But at other times, they're the product of sort of default rules that are in place to facilitate commerce, to make it possible to run an economy. For example, it is not necessary to do much of anything if you just want to start doing your thing as a freelancer. You could simply hang out a shingle and start accepting business. Now, there may be tax and licensing requirements that come into play, but really there's no special legal hoop jumping required. When you're an individual and you're doing business without some kind of legally recognized structure to protect you and separate your personal and business lives, you are what's called a sole proprietor. You are the business, and the business is you. And that means all the risks, liabilities, and the upside is all you and can be handled very easily, but there are risks. Okay, so here we have some other kinds of business entities that you might have heard about. When two or more people get together to do any kind of business, again, without any particular structure set up to protect them, to keep them separate and so on, they are said to be partners. Now, the smart ones do go to the trouble of getting their partnership agreement in writing so there can be fewer misunderstandings, fewer problems. But again, there are default sets of rules in place for those who don't do those things. Now, corporations have been around for centuries. They were used extensively by the Dutch when the first shipping lines came into being. Corporations are kind of a legal fiction that allow the business to be treated like a separate person in the eyes of the law. So in the Dutch model, each ship of a shipping line was its own corporation, separate person, separate assets, separate liabilities, separate risks, separate profits. So this makes it possible for those assets and risks to be kept separate from those belonging to the company's owners. It makes it possible to raise financing by selling shares of ownership while keeping control of management in the hands of a few elected directors and executives. Now, because it keeps things separate, it also shields those owners from risk. Liabilities that befall the company aren't generally passed on to the owners like they are with partnerships and sole proprietors. Here in the US, there are several different types of corporations. Most relevant for our purposes are the traditional, or what's called the C corporation, which is treated as a separate being for tax purposes as well as for everything else, and the S corporation, which passes its profits and losses through to the shareholders, who then are responsible for their own share of taxes, their own respective tax rates apply, and so on. Now, the letters here, S and C, really are simply references to the subsections of the tax code in which they're defined. Now, both have tax advantages and tax consequences, so it's a good idea to get some expert advice when you're making a decision about which kind to be. And finally, we have the limited liability company. This is a much newer form of entity that came to be allowed in some places in the late 1970s. Now they're pretty widely adopted across the United States and a few other countries, and they address some of the friction points that are experienced with corporations. They're a little easier and simpler to run. The founders can retain control more easily, and like corporations, they can be taxed either as a separate being like a C Corp or on a pass-through basis like an S Corp. So why do you need a corporation or an LLC? You might be thinking, hey, it's just me. I don't need the extra hassle and expense of having separate companies and things like that. But I think that forming an entity is really the smart move for most podcasters. Even for hobbyists and amateurs, it's often a wise decision. But if you're going to make this your business and your source of income, then it really becomes important. There are a handful of reasons to form an entity, but the big one is limiting liability. Because Having a corporation or limited liability company shields you, the individual, easy for me to say, the individual owner of the business from risks and liabilities. Things like claims of copyright infringement, violations of rights of privacy, breaches of contract, personal injuries sustained at your business premises, or risks that come from and relate to your staff, your employees, and what have you. You can be pretty sure you're not going to lose your home or your retirement funds if you make a simple mistake, if you have a corporation or an LLC or something in place. And that means that you can actually be bolder. You can take risks, smart ones, of course, the risks that help you propel your business forward toward growth and success. Bottom line, this lets you play bigger with less fear and worry. But there are other reasons as well. The entity structure is just that. It's a structure. It sets up a framework for the management and control of the business. So you'll always know who's in charge and who owns the business, and everybody in the company will know as well. It also allows you to take on investment to fund new projects or company growth. And people and businesses, which are run by people, right, somehow naturally prefer to do business with companies. They offer a sense of stability and permanence that working with individuals sometimes doesn't. Now, your audience may not care very much about that, but your customers, the people who will pay for your products, services, and so on, will. They will find comfort knowing that they're hiring a firm that's serious about its business activities. And because it's a company, it has some continuity even if the individual people change. That's valuable. So here are a few of the factors that you'll want to consider in selecting the right entity type for you. For most podcasters, I think an LLC is probably right, but you really need to get that tax advice I mentioned and be sure to consider long-range planning and how you're going to finance your operations because those can influence your decision making. Now, if you are in California, the tax rates on LLCs can be onerous. Actually, in corporations as well, it can be pretty steep. So that's something you really want to think about. So, Rob, I'm going to get to that question a little later on. I see a question there, but we'll get to that as we wrap up this segment. Okay, so here's a nice little table that lays out the basics of business entities for you and what's possible. And we'll just quickly run through. Corporations, the owners of a corporation are called shareholders. It's managed by an elected board of directors, and the day-to-day operations are managed by officers and staff. The bylaws of a corporation are its governing document. And, in order to enjoy all the protections, you have to keep your funds and property segregated. And when you do distribute profits to the company, it's done in the form of what are called dividends. Now, in an LLC, the owners are called members. The officers are referred to as managers. There may or may not be a board of directors. Usually that would be a panel of managers. The members can be the managers, and managers can be members, of course. And the governing document is called an operating agreement. Now, in an LLC, again, you have to keep your funds and property segregated, separate, so that the separateness is recognized by the law. And again, you can distribute profits to the owners periodically under the agreement or whatever. Now, when should you form an entity? Well, I say it's the right time to form an entity when you're serious about operating as a business. Earlier is better because things like liabilities, losses can happen fast and out of the blue. And yes, podcasting, really any kind of media production or distribution is risky. It may not seem like it, but there are lots of risks. Intellectual property claims over copyrights and trademarks are increasingly common. Contract issues start to come up more and more regularly in this business. Believe me, I'm seeing it. Arguments about ownership, all of this stuff. And when people see a company, when people see a media operation like a podcast, they immediately think that there's some money behind it, even if we know that's not always the case. So I say form your company early, but certainly when you're engaging in business operations that have risk, or you have personal assets that are worth protecting, where there's a tax advantage, so talk to your tax guy, where you're taking on partners or collaborators, and you certainly need to do it if you're taking on investors. You should consider this when you're hiring employees and when you are developing an exit strategy. Now, forming an entity is relatively easy and straightforward. It's complicated. There's a lot to it, but it's not hard. You form by filing articles of organization or incorporation with your state Secretary of State's office. You obtain an employer identification number. It's a tax ID number. You tell the government how you want to be taxed. Is it that S pass-through form or as a taxable entity? And draft those bylaws, that operating agreement, whatever that governing document is going to be, and make sure it covers things the way you want to cover it. And then you issue stock certificates or membership certificates to the owners. And there you go. And inside my Easy Legal for Podcasters program, I walk you through each step of this in much greater detail. There are forms and templates and guides for everything. More about that later. Now, once the entity has been formed, a few more relatively basic steps. You have to transfer any existing business assets into the company. You have to negotiate and draft and execute agreements with your employees and your staff, your independent contractors and your vendors. Or if you have existing agreements, you transfer those to the company. Those are considered assets as well. If there are multiple owners, you need to have annual meetings if it's a corporation. LLCs is a little more flexible there. And there are some annual reporting and tax filings that are necessary. So there's a little extra complexity, but not really too much more. So that's the basics of entity choice and the business structure that is a hallmark of professionalism. So Rob, your question. I've seen suggestions that for full protection, an LLC needs at least 2 members. So for an individual, you may want to form an empty corporation as the second LLC member. What are your thoughts? Rob, I have not actually heard that advice before, and I don't think it's really valid. You do not, in most states, there may be some places where an LLC doesn't really exist for a single member. And part of this may come from some confusion around the way the tax refers to it. The IRS refers to a single member LLC as a, quote, disregarded entity. But that doesn't mean that the law treats it as disregarded. It is still a valid entity. It forms that shield of protection and so on. Whether you have 1 member or 10 members or thousands of members, the LLC entity, assuming you are doing things right, that is keeping things segregated, holding the meetings, and following the protocols that are laid out in your operating agreement, you will enjoy the protection that comes from the entity. Single member or more members doesn't matter. Now, one thing I will say is for some kinds of risk and liability, if you are the host of your show and you are a single member company and you get on your show and you say something horrible about someone else, well, that is you, the person, saying it, even though it's under the umbrella of the company. You're acting in your own personal capacity as well as in your capacity as the owner of the company. So there may be a possibility of some risk there, but that's not a major concern, at least not in my view. So I say, do it. Sorry, I need to be the owner of the company. So re-click on something. Maybe all right. My comments just popped off the screen. So thank you, Rob, for that comment. Let me expand this real quickly here. There we go. Okay. Moving on. Unless there's other questions. But that's not a major concern. Come on. At least not in my view. So how do I mute it? Where's my mute button? Do it. There it is. Sorry. I apologize. Okay. No tech problems here. It's all problem between the keyboard and the chair today. So anyway, all right. So let's go talking on about the second hallmark that I refer to, and that is having a legit team structure in place. Now, when I talk about team, I'm talking about everybody who works with you and helps you in your podcasting operations. But even if you are just at the one person, do it all yourself stage of things, I want you to go through this exercise of developing an org chart. Really figure out all the different roles and responsibilities, all the different hats that need to be worn in the business, all the jobs that need to get done for the business to operate and thrive and grow. And inside your companion workbook, there is a sort of an org chart template that you can start to use to fill it out. But you can do this very easily, lots of other ways as well. Even just pencil and paper will do it. Now, essentially what we're doing is figuring out the departments within our companies. You'll have operations, obviously. That's where the actual development and production and publishing happens. But you'll also have accounting and finance. And if you're going to be a legit business, you got to have customers. That means sales and marketing. Now, you don't have to fill out the who for all the various roles, who's going to wear all those hats, but it's really wise to figure out the what. What things need to be managed. So as you grow and build your team, you'll be able to prioritize your hiring and figure out who you're bringing on board. And I do recommend that you begin building out your team as soon as possible, sooner than it feels might be comfortable. Just having one part-time virtual assistant to handle some of the jobs can be real fuel for your success and growth. Think about it. If you didn't have to write show notes yourself, if you could hand over the finished audio and know that the material is going to get edited, posted, promoted, marketed, those kinds of things, you could focus your energies on higher level tasks, right? So eventually you want to design your business so that you could take a month or more off and everything would run smoothly without you, right? Does that sound good? Taking time off and letting the business hum along? That's what business owners do, right? You own the factory. You're not down there pulling the lever on the machine every day. You're managing the people and setting up systems and practices so that the business will hum along even if you're busy doing something else, playing with your kids, going for a walk, taking a vacation, right? Okay. Now, of course, you're going to keep doing the jobs and tasks that only you should do. And the jobs that only you that you really love, of course. If you are the voice talent of a podcast, you can't really offload that to someone else, maybe as a guest host once in a while. But could you let someone else do the research and give you an outline of what you need to know? What about the writing, the editing? You get the point. You could hire a part-time bookkeeper to come in once a week or so and keep your accounts in order. It doesn't have to be a full-time person. Marketing. Sometimes a virtual assistant can handle social media, or you could have a specialist social media manager. Promotions, outreach, advertising for audience development, all can be handled by others, especially if it's not something you love and are good at. Wouldn't it be nice to show up, spend a bit of time reviewing your notes, and then just record your show and know everything else is falling in line because you've got the right team trained to get things done without you having to be so hands-on? That would be awesome. Here's what my team looks like for my podcast, and this is just an example, and I'm more hands-on than many need to be. There's me, obviously, the host and producer, and my co-host, Tamara Bennett. I've got a managing editor who is a volunteer. He started with me as an intern when he was in law school, and he's a practicing lawyer for years now, and he is still on the team and helps out. And a team of law students and lawyers, one's actually a retired lawyer, who find the news and the cases that we cover, and we meet about a half an hour a week online on Zoom, and we decide what stories are going to go into the rundown. Then they go off and write the summaries. And then the night before the recording, Tamara and I review the rundown, do a little follow-up research of our own if we want, and then we just show up and do our recording. Now, our show doesn't involve any editing. It's record to publish, bang, we're done. I do have some automated tools that I use to do some audio sweetening before delivering the media to the hosting server and that kind of thing, but that's about it. Meanwhile, my VA, who lives in the Philippines, her name is Joanna. Hi, Joanna. Is converting our rundown outline into the show notes. Now, ours are pretty rudimentary. That's just the headline and the link that we're following to the more detailed story. And when the audio file is ready and on the server, she publishes the episode, generates the social media and promotional materials, and off we go. I do a little more promotion. Tamara does her end of it as well, but that's about it. So for each episode that we publish, I'm only involved in story selection and recording and a little bit of promotion on the back end. And in a pinch, if I'm not available on a Sunday night when we have our meetings, my managing editor runs that weekly meeting without me. And it works. So here's some of the other kinds of roles that your team members might fulfill. Partners, hosts, co-hosts, editors, producers, writers, researchers, freelance designers, and what have you. VAs, sales personnel, ad sales, that is, right? Or anybody else who contributes in some way to your podcast should be considered a part of your team. So when you have a team, though, it is super important that everybody has a clear, precise understanding of the relationships and the organizational structures of things. You can't leave this stuff to chance or presumption or surmise. Who's in charge? Who owns the show, the assets, the stuff? But also, who owns the audience? How do you own the audience? What about the mailing list, the online accounts, the RSS feeds? Everything needs to be accounted for, or real trouble can follow. Who does what? Who gets what? Do they get a salary, an hourly wage, some kind of profit share? Do they get commissions? Do they get kudos, thanks, and credit? What is it? And you got to handle the big what happens if questions. And the bottom line is this. If you have co-owners, you've got to have a podcast prenup. Now, we're going to cover copyright law basics a little more in a few minutes, but when two or more people come together to create something like podcast episodes, they are treated as joint authors unless there's a clear indication that they intend otherwise. So when you sit down with your co-host, unless there's something clear to indicate that he or she is merely a co-host, you can find yourself in the situation of having a co-owner. Karen, I see your comment. It stresses you out. Please don't stress out. My job here is to educate you and show you how you can do these things easily. So stick with me. Okay. This is why I say it's so important. Remember, you could have a co-owner if you're not careful. This is why I say it's so important to have what I call a podcast prenup. Now, what I mean by a written agreement is a written agreement of some sort between the parties who are creating the show. Might be in the form of a co-host agreement or a co-production agreement. It could be in the form of your LLC operating agreement, where the members of the company outline their respective ownership and responsibilities, rights, and compensation. But even in that scenario, it's not a bad idea to have separate host agreements with each person as well, or other kinds of agreements depending on their jobs. And this also applies to people who may not be on the microphone. A producer, a writer, an editor could also be considered a joint author and therefore a co-owner. No creative input to the project should be left unconsidered. Okay? So, it's really important to give some consideration to these kinds of questions. Who is a partner? How much and what does each contributor own? What are the various people's responsibilities? Who's responsible for the expenses and in what proportions? How are revenues going to be allocated and profits calculated? What happens if somebody decides to leave? Who gets the house and kids? That's your episode content, your show title, the intellectual property, the physical equipment, the materials, the right to continue forward with the show, and the RSS feed, your audience, the email list. See why I call it a prenup, right? Who gets the house and kids? And what happens if somebody dies? Does that person's heirs suddenly become partners in the creation of your podcast? Do they own things? Got to figure some of this stuff out. So, in the host and co-host and talent side, same questions. What's the nature of the relationship? Are they a co-owner? Are they a gun for hire? Are they some kind of volunteer? What's expected of them? When, where, how, and how much? This is often a sticking point between co-hosts, so it's better to have that prenup, right? What's the compensation or profit sharing structure? Who's doing what responsibilities will often affect that. What happens if someone wants to leave? What happens in terms of who gets to buy the other out and those kinds of things? So bottom line, get a prenup. And this includes your guests. Now, you've heard me talk about this before, so I won't belabor the point. Guests could start to look like joint authors if not careful. Guests have to give consent to be recorded and for certain kinds of uses of those recordings. They should agree that they're not going to have any approval rights or editorial rights, or if they are, you should be very clear to outline what they are. That should be on paper in writing. And guests need to waive their potential claims against you forever, irrevocably. Now, I put sign in single quotes on this slide because it's not always possible to secure manifestation of assent to the terms without a formal wet ink or paper kind of contract. But here it usually is possible. E-signatures, checkboxes on websites, even just a simple email exchange saying, I agree, can be good enough. What's important, though, is that you get a clear, unequivocal acceptance of terms that have been fully laid out each and every time. Now, worker classification, that's the question between employee or independent contractor, is really important because it determines whether the employer has to withhold income taxes, pay Social Security and Medicare, unemployment and insurance, those kinds of things. Businesses normally don't have to withhold or pay taxes on payments to independent contractors. And the earnings of that person working under the independent contractor basis are subject to self-employment tax. But the general rule is that an individual is an independent contractor if the payer has the right to control or direct only the result of the work, not what, where, and how it's going to be done. So the results only. Small businesses really need to consider all evidence of the degree of control and independence in the employer-worker relationship. Whether a worker is an independent contractor or employee depends on the facts in each situation. So there are three categories that you want to sort of consider here: behavioral control, financial control, and the relationship of the parties. Now, misclassifying an employee as an independent contractor when they really should be an employee has consequences. The employer would be liable for back employment taxes, as well as penalties and interest on those back taxes and so on. And here in California, we've got a new law that makes this really hard now to define anybody as an independent contractor. I don't want to go too far into this for those who aren't in California, but if you are in California, pay attention to AB 5 and what that ABC test looks like. Reach out to me if you want to have a further discussion about it. Some other key contract clauses that you need to have in your contracts. This is with everybody on your team. Work made for hire. This is a copyright principle that says that the employer or the paying party would own the results and proceeds of the person's work. Confidentiality, non-competition, warranties. These are the promises about originality and ownership of things, quality of work, those kinds of things. Indemnities, this is the hold harmless language. Remedies, what happens if something goes wrong? Injunctive relief means that they can't get an injunction against you if they decide they don't like something and they want to sue. They can't get a restraining order against publication of the show. Especially true for the guest release and things like that. And how are we going to deal with dispute resolution? You might want to make sure it's confidential, and that you do through mediation or arbitration, because going to court is a public proceeding, and the records of that public proceeding are on file for anyone to see. A few other things. Some of your people may command something more than a basic release or independent contractor agreement. Like if you're hiring an editor, well, you want that person to have some editorial discretion. So you need to give them the permission to edit the episode, which is making a derivative work, right? Music, special circumstances. Composers of original music can command a pretty high price for a complete transfer of rights, that work made for hire language. So sometimes they do the work and then grant you a license to use it in your podcast and reserve other rights. I see this coming up fairly frequently, and it's something you just need to be thoughtful about how it happens. You may have some folks like composers and musicians who expect to get a payment from revenues if and when money comes in. A royalty is really just a recurring payment obligation to a rights holder for the use of their material. So that might be a percentage of revenues or a fixed dollar figure per episode or per month or per year. There's always all kinds of different ways to handle it. Revenue sharing deals are common when you have collaborators and co-production deals and things like that. It just needs to be clearly laid out. How do they share the revenue? And lots of room for other kinds of flexibility. Contracts are great tools. They can handle things really, really well. But you have to get them down in writing so there aren't any misunderstandings or changing interpretations. Yes, it's possible to have an oral contract, but it's sometimes impossible to prove what it said. So be very careful. So let me see. I've got some other questions here. Rob asked about insurance, errors and omissions insurance that I recommend. Is there a type? It's called media errors and omissions insurance, and it's a little hard to find. There are some brokers out there that you can reach out to, and if you need a referral, let me know. I don't want to do it here publicly, but it'll depend where you're located also. Will mentions using an LLC using a LegalZoom, to form their LLC. Not sure what you mean by disclaimers, Will, but that's okay. I am not a huge fan of LegalZoom. Sometimes it works okay, and sometimes it's vending machine law documents. So be thoughtful and careful about that. My goal is to show you how to do these things yourself, so you don't even need to do that, and you can trust it. Will says, about the stressing out, Karen. Once you get through the setup that I'm referring to, the stress level is actually reduced. That's the goal. Yeah. And Rob says, if you go through a dry run on paper, it becomes more comfortable. Yeah, exactly. Wireframing this stuff, laying it out. That's why I want you to do that org chart, because you'll start to see who's where and things like that. And that you're sort of simulating the issues on paper. Rob's even talking about simulating a harassment lawsuit issue to make sure you got things right and so on. Yeah, exactly. And Rob, you're talking about the formalities of granting another party the right to use your products or to cross market. Absolutely, you want to get that in writing. Sometimes a simple email is enough to do it, but not always. So, good point though. And yes, you want to make sure that you're very clear on the scope and parameters of the license that you're granting other people. That is what licensing is granting other people the right to use your property, your products, your brands, your names, your content, whatever it is, and to cross-market things. It's best to get those things documented. This is, as I said, a hallmark of professionalism is getting it in writing, being clear, thinking stuff through rather than, I'll worry about it later, and then handling it when there's an ambiguity and everybody's pointing fingers and getting angry, right? Good fences make good neighbors. Good contracts make good business associates. Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to move on now. I hope the conversation about team structure has given you some good food for thought. This is how pros operate, how you play that bigger game and build that thriving, growing business. Plus, you're creating jobs and opportunities for people, so it's a win-win. The contracts for these things aren't that hard to create, and there are resources inside the Easy Legal program that I'll be telling you about in a few days. But for now, why not get started on that org chart? And if you do already have team members working for you, sit down and write out some bullet points, their job description. Cover the nature, scope, rights, and responsibilities, and the compensation arrangements that you have in mind for those folks, and discuss them with them. You may find that there's already some misunderstandings or whatever, and it's best to get those out of the way sooner rather than later. So now I'm going to move on to your legit intellectual property strategy. Intellectual property. Some people refer to intellectual property as products of the mind. And it's true. It's intangible kinds of things. But how do you protect something that's intangible? You can't, put it in a safe or lock it to a fence, right? Intellectual property is the result of people's mental, intellectual work. And we live in an information age, and that means that we are creating more and more kinds of this material every single day. We're talking about patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets. Now, intellectual property is not a new concept. These ideas have been around for a very good long time, actually originating as far back as ancient Rome, where there's evidence that bakers were given exclusive rights in their new recipes for a period of time. And then we see it again in jolly old England, where protection for copyrights was enacted by the Statute of Anne in 1710. And the statute of monopolies, which protected patents, was a little earlier, I think 1640, 1660, something like that. And here in the US, the founding fathers of the US brought the concept over with them, and they put it in our Constitution. This is what's known as the Copyright or Patent Clause. It says, Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. And if you notice some odd capitalization there, that's the way it is in the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, not Thomas Jefferson, the framers, the way they wrote it in the Constitution. So don't look at me. That's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the United States Constitution. I'm going to rip through these pretty quickly, but I wanted to just give you the background. Patent law protects inventions and systems and designs that are unique and not obvious to the ordinary practitioner of the business, of the trade, for a term of about up to 20 years. Now, patent probably isn't going to apply to most podcasters unless your business develops some software processes or devices. So I'm not going to spend any more time on patents. If you have the issue, if you're inventing things, then reach out and we'll talk about patent protection. This is not do-it-yourself stuff in any event. Now, a trademark or a service mark, as the case may be, is a distinctive word or symbol or mark or phrase that's used to distinguish the goods or services of one supplier from others in the marketplace. It's a brand, just like the brands that are used to indicate what ranch a particular cow had come from. a mark affixed to the goods that tells you the source or origin of the goods. It's that simple. Here's some examples. Now, trademark protection is not available for the title of a single work, but it is available for titles of series of works, like a podcast title, where there's a common name or source of origin across multiple things, products, lines, episodes, whatever. You can get a trademark. And if you offer your services or sell goods, trademark protection could be available for those things as well. It's handled by a category of goods or services on a category by category basis. So t-shirts, for example, would be in a different class than podcasts or food or what have you. I want you to protect your show title as a trademark. That means select the title. If you haven't already selected it, select it carefully. It should be distinctive, that is, not descriptive. It shouldn't be similar to others. You don't want any confusion. That's what trademarks are about, is eliminating, protecting the consumers against confusion. It could be coined or fanciful or incongruous, just as long as it's not descriptive. And please, register your trademarks with the USPTO, that's the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and or in other countries, depending on your circumstances. Now, in case you don't think this is really necessary, I want to read to you from a letter that I received from a client that illustrates why it's such an important step. This is from my client, Shane Waters. Shane says, I noticed that you talk about the importance of protecting your business behind podcasts. I want you to feel free to use this headache that we experienced as an example. I hired you to do our trademarks because a documentary used our name. My podcast used to be called Out of the Shadows, and although it was more than 3 years old and we had a ton of news articles and interviews online, when the documentary Out of the Shadows released suddenly, it pushed all of our links and everything on Google way down deep, buried them. So to make things worse, in the documentary, which is an independent one, it was released to YouTube with millions of downloads. The makers remained anonymous, and it's about extreme conspiracy theories. Remember Pizzagate and the people shooting up a pizza place because the conspiracy theories said a bunch of Democrats in Washington were running a child sex ring in its basement? The producers of the documentary are those same people. Well, overnight after the release, people thought that our podcast had something to do with the documentary. Hundreds of emails and messages on Facebook coming to us daily. Some were praise and others were death threats. The documentary blames the media for all the world's problems. So when people started to realize that we weren't involved, but we were media, they went on the attack anyway. That huge headache led us to rebranding after a 4-year stint as Out of the Shadows. And that's why we're now ready to trademark our new title. I'm not going to get into that specifically, but you can see that they had built the value of this brand for themselves. But along came someone else, did something they shouldn't have done, and there was no recourse really to stop it. Had there been a trademark registration, we would have been armed with the tools to get those videos taken down and to tell the filmmakers, stop it, don't use that title, maybe. At least it would have helped us protect the rights. So that's why trademark. Now I'm going to move on to copyright. So copyright protection covers original works of authorship, things like writings, paintings, songs, recordings, once they're fixed in some tangible form. And copyrights last a good long time, 70 years beyond the death of the author, or for older works prior to 1978, a total of 95 years. Now, the author, that is the creator of the work, is the owner and owns a set of 5 exclusive rights. The right to make copies, to distribute copies, to make derivative works, and to display or perform those things in public. Now, to get a copyright, all you do is create the work, save it to your hard drive, you record it on tape or whatever, and it's good to go. It just needs to be original. It needs to be expression, not facts or ideas. Those aren't protected. It needs to be fixed in some tangible form. That's the recording, or it has to be something that could actually be copied or reproduced. And it can't be something that's mainly utilitarian, like a chair or designed for a dress or something like that. You might be able to protect the aesthetic elements of those things, but not the functional or utilitarian components. And once you've authored a copyright protected work, that's it. There is no requirement that you register it unless you're going to sue someone. There are good reasons to do so, and I'll explain why in a second, and I'll show you exactly how to do that inside the course. Okay, copyright infringement happens when someone uses any of those exclusive rights I mentioned without the permission from the copyright owner. In court, you have to prove that the alleged infringer copied the work, had access to it, and that the work is substantially similar. From those two pieces of proof, that's a conclusion of copying. Copyright infringement carries damage awards as high as $150,000 per infringement, and courts can often order injunctions against further copying and things like that. Now, anytime I talk about copyright infringement, somebody says, hey, what about fair use? But it's fair use. Well, fair use is the part of the copyright law designed to reconcile this protective regime that says you can't make copies with the freedom of speech and press that's guaranteed under the First Amendment. But there are no rules of thumb here. A fair use defense requires a detailed analysis of 4 equally important factors and a balancing to determine whether the use is infringement or fair use. You have to do this for each alleged act of infringement, and that's time-consuming and it's expensive. That's why I say reliance on fair use usually isn't the right choice, even if you think what you're doing is fair use. It's a defense to copyright infringement. Defense means you're defending a lawsuit. Someone is suing you. You're hiring lawyers. You're getting involved in a process that can last years and significant expense. Now, another thing we often hear is, but I'm doing parody. Well, a parody, which sometimes is referred to as a spoof, is essentially imitative work. It uses the skeleton of an original work and it adds its own comedic elements that strive towards either exaggerating the flaws of the original or trivializing it, or sometimes both. Now, satire, on the other hand, uses irony or sometimes exaggeration to expose vices and shortcomings of an entity, be it an individual or a complex and independent system such as society or government or the military or whatever. Now, humor might be a part of it, but the end result is almost never funny. It's used to elicit thinking and realization in the audience. Satire isn't a parody of the original thing, the original work. It's using the work as a tool to poke fun and exaggerate and those kinds of things. So parody is protected under fair use, as a free speech thing. But satire isn't always protected. If it copies someone else's work, if it's not designed to poke fun at that work, or maybe the category of work that falls in, it's probably not going to qualify as a fair use. When you're doing parody, you're allowed to take enough to conjure up the original and no more. So be thoughtful. Now, there's a picture of Weird Al Yankovic here, and I just want to say that Weird Al is a classic, famous parodist, but he actually gets permission every time he does a parody. So he's not a good example as far as relying on fair use, but it's a good example of what parody is. Okay, so the general rule is that authorship equals ownership. Now, work made for hire, I talked about that earlier, means that the employer owns the work created by its employees during the ordinary course and scope of their employment. And in certain instances, commissioning parties can own certain kinds of works, even if created by an independent contractor. That's that second paragraph there at the bottom. A work specially ordered or commissioned for use as a contribution to a collective work, as part of a motion picture or other audiovisual work, as a translation, as a supplementary work, as a compilation, as an instructional test, as answer material for a test, or as an atlas. Those kinds of works can be created as works for hire if the parties expressly agree in a written instrument signed by them that the work shall be considered a work made for hire. I think podcasting, nowadays we're doing a lot of video podcasts as well. I think it's fair to consider them audiovisual works. But when we do these contracts, I also include what we call a backup assignment, where where the person is also transferring any ownership that may be retained. I know it seems a little complicated. Okay. Joint ownership. This could happen when 2 or more authors work jointly with the intent to create a single unitary whole. Think host and guest. Think podcasting production team, right? Working jointly to create a single work. Or it could occur if there's a division of ownership by contract or court order or testamentary transfer. That means a will, right? Somebody dies and leaves it to their kids, it gets divided up, right? Okay. Now, the fourth kind of intellectual property we need to talk about is the trade secret. Information that's not publicly available, but valuable to a business because it's not available to the competitors. Examples are your client list, your vendor list, your Coca-Cola formula, the 11 herbs and spices at KFC, for example. The way you protect it is by keeping it secret and making sure anybody you do have to share it with, on a need-to-know basis only, also promises to keep it secret. Mark things confidential if you intend that they be treated that way, and make sure that your people, anybody you're sharing it with, promises to keep things marked confidential. So your intellectual property strategy, your legit strategy, the best practice to get legit and behave professionally, get a protectable title for your podcast, choose something distinctive, as I said, run a search, not just iTunes, not just Google, real search. Make sure it's not similar to other titles already out there. Run a trademark search. Register your title as a trademark so that if anyone comes along and uses something similar, you can point the registration out and say, hey, stop. Most of the time, that's all it takes. Policing your trademark means staying on top of what's going on out there. Next up, protect your content. Keep good records to prove what you created and when. Using computers nowadays, that's pretty easy, right? Date and timestamps and things are pretty good. Shouldn't be too hard. Make sure you have backups so you don't lose things if there's a problem. Put copyright notice on every work that you create. It's not hard to do, and I can show you exactly how that's done inside the course. It's the C circle symbol or the circle P symbol, depending on whether it's a text work or a recorded work. Use both, right? Along with the year and the owner's name. Registration is not required, but it is a good idea. Lots of good reasons, namely the availability of attorney's fees. If you registered within 3 months of first publication and before the infringement occurred, and you have to sue, you could get your attorney's fees paid by the defendant, as well as statutory damages. Without having to prove your actual out-of-pocket loss, you can get the court to award you money in varying amounts, but you can get them to award you money based on the fact that you have a registered copyright. Now, there is a fee for registration, so it can add up if you're putting out episodes every week, but we're creating lessons inside the course that show some tricks on how to save some money on this. And whether you've registered your copyrights or not, if you do find copying of stuff out there, you can use the DMCA takedown procedure. It's a pretty basic notification sent to the service provider hosting the offending content. It's quick and it's effective, but you shouldn't abuse it. There's consequences if you misuse it, those kinds of things. Will points out that the Circle C is option G on a Mac. That's right. Will, if you can find out what the Circle P is, that would be helpful too, because that stands for phonorecord, which deals for any sound recordings. So you want to use the P if it's the audio. And you want to put that on your show notes and things like that. Okay. Next up, protect your property by keeping your ideas, processes, systems, data, lists, those kinds of things as secret as possible. Confidentiality clauses in the written contracts with your team members and with anybody else that needs access to the information. Have them sign an NDA. That's a confidential non-disclosure agreement, right? Finally, last part of the strategy for intellectual property is respect other people's stuff. It is okay for you to talk about other people's brands and products, even if you're not, especially, only if you're not using them as a brand. So I can say, I drink Coca-Cola. I'm not using it as a brand. I'm not saying it's brought to you by or those kinds of things. Now, it's not okay to use other people's copyright protected material to copy unless you have permission or a fairly clear fair use case. And I'm saying you probably don't have fair use, especially with music where there are two copyrights. There's the composition created by the songwriter and usually administered by a music publishing company. And there's the master recording. That's usually the artist and the label involved in that, usually a record company. Don't plagiarize. Use your own research, your investigation, journalism, and so on. It's not okay to simply paraphrase what others have written. You need to do your own work, your own writing. So I hope this gives you a picture of how important it is to have clear, easy to follow intellectual property creation and protection strategy in place. If you've already been podcasting for a while, you probably have a bunch of IP assets out there floating around. And if you're like most, you don't have a clear inventory of what you actually have. So that's the homework assignment. Either you or someone on your team start assembling your inventory. This is good work for a virtual assistant, actually. Figure out what you own and get it into some kind of a database or spreadsheet. You need that list when you go to transfer everything into your entity. You need that list if you end up selling your company or your business. I think when you sit down to consider it, you will be surprised at how much of this is actually there, and it's valuable. You may not think it's particularly valuable right now, but keeping track of it lets you maximize that value when and if the time comes. So let me see if you have any questions about the intellectual property. Rob, I'm going to come back to your questions about LLCs and naming at the very end today, so stick around. Any questions on the IP stuff I just covered? Okay, I'm going to move on. We'll get on to the legit client and customer strategy. In other words, monetization. So let's focus on monetization just for a few minutes. There are a number of different ways to monetize podcasting. They all work, some better than others, depends on your goals, depends on your circumstances, depends on the size of your audience and what you have in mind. So I want to talk first about indirect monetization. When you're using, this is where you're using the podcast as a traffic strategy to drive sales of your primary business. A free service at the beginning of the sales cycle. Get them into your funnel. It builds awareness, affinity, and trust. This is the brought to you by messaging when it's your stuff that you're selling, that you're promoting. Now, should the podcast then be an internal part of your business operation or a subsidiary, or should you have that separateness of another entity? This requires a little thinking and analysis, but be sure to document those relationships if you do have separate companies or subsidiaries. Make sure it's clearly identified who owns things and how it's managed and those kinds of things. Are employees of your business also working on the podcast? If it's under another entity, again, we've got to have some clear transfers of ownership there of the intellectual property. You can do that by essentially lending your employees from one company to the other for certain purposes. And how are you going to treat the expenses and revenues for purposes of taxes? Some of the kinds of things. A little on the complicated side, but not outrageous. Another approach to raising money for your show is from donors. This is where you ask listeners to make a simple donation to support the podcast. Now, donations are generally not tax deductible unless the podcast is organized under the roof of a nonprofit organization and has the proper tax exemptions granted by the tax authorities, or if the donations are processed through what's called a fiscal sponsor. It has to comply with the sponsor's rules and terms, and it has to be in accordance with the sponsor's purpose and goals, right? It has to serve the charitable purpose. Now, nonprofit fundraising is subject to a host of federal, state, and local regulations, and you have to comply in each jurisdiction where potential donors are located and approached. So you got to watch out, especially when you're using raffles and sweepstakes and game kinds of things as structures. Example, here in the city of Los Angeles, a charity has to file a notice of intention with the Police Commission's Charitable Services section 15 days prior to starting any fundraising campaign or special event that involves solicitations for charitable purposes. The charity is then issued an information card that then has to be provided to all of the people that you approach for donations. Lots of other jurisdictions have similar requirements, so you got to be very careful. And if you're using a sweepstakes or a giveaway or other kind of gaming, there may be registration requirements, very rigid rules and record keeping and those kinds of things. So if you're going to go that route, let's make sure we do the research and get it right for your particular place. Crowdfunding. Here you're looking at something similar to that donor-based funding, where you're seeking small amounts from lots of people, usually leveraging social media, web-based platform portals, things like that. There's several different kinds, but equity crowdfunding is one. And that's complicated securities law stuff we have to talk about. But gift-based crowdfunding is one where it's just they're giving you a donation, basically. Again, not tax deductible, but it's a gift. And the other is the sales style crowdfunding where there's a quid pro quo. They're getting something in exchange. Maybe it's a t-shirt, maybe it's a special bonus episodes, something like that. Generally, to succeed with this, you need a large social media email audience, social media and or email audience. Typically, there's some kind of a quid pro quo, bonuses, incentives, and so on. And the legal terms are going to be governed by the platform that you're using. So you're going to want to review those terms and services and specifications. Generally, we do these on a time-limited basis with a closed end date. You're doing a fundraising campaign rather than all to always open kind of fundraising. And you're entering into a contract with the people who are funding you. So if you've promised them something in exchange, you've got to fulfill on those promises. There have been cases by funders against projects that didn't fulfill in a timely way. Be careful. Next, we have the merchandise strategy. Similar to the indirect model, you're selling products to your service by using the podcast to get them interested and excited about it. Making real money using this strategy means having a large audience and products that they're interested in, or very high ticket products that they want. And you got to keep coming up with new products or attracting new audience, or both. Legal issues are things like products liability. If the thing you're selling has potential to hurt them, that's an issue. You're going to have to make certain warranties and promises about the quality and suitability of the materials that you're selling. You're going to need to have agreements with your manufacturers and how you're going to fulfill. And if it's coming from overseas, you're going to have to get through customs. And you might have issues with counterfeit goods being sold and undermining your efforts. And then we have the freemium model. This is similar to crowdfunding with the quid pro quo, where you have some or all episodes available for free, and some have some kind of an additional value offered for those who pay or donate. Maybe it's a full episode where you get a preview on the free feed, or maybe it's additional episodes that are only available for subscribers. This is a contract. Your terms have to match the offer as it's made in your episodes, on your sales pages, and so on. And the failure to fulfill that value proposition is a breach of contract that can bring liability. Certainly, it'll hurt your reputation if you don't. Certainly, people will cancel their subscriptions, those kinds of things. Here we're talking about the Patreon and that sort of class of things. And then there's the subscription podcast model. This is starting to grow in popularity. Episodes are behind some kind of a paywall or on an exclusive basis to subscribers or users of a particular platform or service. Think about Spotify or Audible, for example. Single podcasts using membership platforms also. The trick becomes marketing to attract subscribers, especially for that single. If you're a standalone podcast putting it behind a paywall, you better have a real plan for marketing. The legal issues, of course, is that sometimes the guests come out of the woodwork and expect to be paid for their appearance. So you want to make sure you have good releases. The contract terms between the distributor, the platform, and the subscriber, or you and the subscriber if you're in that single podcast mode. The content supply needs to be consistent. You got to deliver episodes as promised. Paying subscribers have higher expectations. They have more demands. And anytime you're processing payments, there are risks associated with the privacy and data security, data breaches, those kinds of things. So choose your vendors carefully, make sure they comply with all the necessary requirements, and so on. Getting toward the end here, folks, bear with me. The affiliate and endorsement ads model is one of the easiest and most common ways that podcasters generate money for their shows. They promote other people's products and services on basically a commissioned sales basis. The seller of the product usually agrees to give the affiliate some percentage of the sales price for any transaction that uses a special tracking code or through a particular URL. And if you're going to do this kind of thing, you've got to understand there are rules to this game. You got to sign up as an affiliate, agree to the seller's terms. You got to read and understand the rules and requirements. And you have to understand the FTC regulations. That's the Federal Trade Commission, the U.S. government agency that regulates advertising to protect consumers. They have a set of guidelines of how affiliates and endorsers need to behave. And both the seller and the affiliate can suffer consequences if the guidelines aren't followed. Bottom line, the guidelines are about full disclosure. If you're getting something of value, you have to tell your audience. If you're getting a cash commission, you say so. If you're getting free goods, like unboxing episodes where they send you the stuff for free, you got to say so. Now, if you're not required to return them, you got to tell the audience about that. The disclosures need to be clear and conspicuous. No tiny fonts or odd-colored text. If you're doing audio, the disclosure should be audio. If it's in print, it should be print. If you're doing show notes, include the disclosure there as well. If you're doing video, audio, video, and in print, make sure you put a disclaimer on the screen, the disclosure on the screen. And it's supposed to be as closely adjacent to the endorsement or review or ad as possible. Can't be buried at the very end of the episode or in the footer of a post. Right there, next to the paid message. That's what's required. Easy rule of thumb to apply here. If you as a consumer would want to know that the person speaking is getting compensated for saying what they're saying, you should make that disclosure. How you do that is a bit flexible. Sometimes it's, hey, they sent me a free whatchamacallit to review. Here's what I think. Or I recommend this and you can get it using my affiliate link. And because I'm an affiliate, I'll get a commission. Thanks for supporting the show. Lots of different ways. This is not exactly the same as sponsored by or brought to you by, so be careful about the words you use. But if you make it clear that the message is paid, you're in good shape. Don't do anything that would be considered deceptive or misleading. Be honest and open with your audience. This brings me to the pay-to-play model. I think that when the guest pays the host to have you on the show, to be on the show, that amounts to an endorsement by the producer of the show. Essentially, you're selling access to the audience, and those same principles of disclosure should apply. Make it clear and conspicuous, repeat it at the beginning and the end of the interview, maybe somewhere in the middle as well. People sometimes skip intros, and they don't listen to the outros, right? So imagine how you would feel if your favorite podcast featured an interview with some author. You go and you buy the book or an online course that's offered by the guest or something like that. And after you spend all that money, you learn that the podcast host got paid to feature the guest. You might feel a little betrayed. Regardless of how good the book or course is, you were deprived of the right to make a well-informed purchase decision, not given the chance to weigh the value of the endorsement. That's the point. Consumers have the right to know when a person is getting paid as a spokesperson for a product or service. That applies to endorsing a guest. Follow those rules. Clear and conspicuous disclosure. No omissions, deceptions, or misleading. And lastly, we get to sponsorship deal terms, sponsorship advertising. The goal for lots of podcasters, but certainly as I've demonstrated, it's not the only way to make money from a show. You bring on a sponsor for your podcast. It certainly works. It's one of the best ways to monetize once your audience reaches a certain critical mass in terms of size and attention. That's when brands or businesses will find value in reaching your audience by advertising on your program. Basic transaction is pretty simple. Money in exchange for sharing a message with the audience. But the deals have lots of little moving parts. They can get tricky pretty fast. So some of the terms you want to think about are the term. How long is this relationship? Single message, multiple episodes, a campaign over a period of time, month to month. Is there a guarantee? Get this figured out. It might not be worth it to take a sponsor for a single episode or just a 1 month commitment. What's included? Are you going to help them write and create the ads? Is it host-read or pre-recorded? Will it be scripted or ad-libbed? Will the sponsor get mentioned in the show notes, websites, on video? All these things have value, and you can negotiate, and you need to be careful to describe very specifically what they get. Payment terms, of course. How much will they pay? When? How? Approval rights. Who gets to approve what? Sponsors going to want to approve the content of the ad sometimes, but you can't let them determine the content of your show. They may not want to be affiliated with episodes of programs that that discuss certain topics or viewpoints. So compromise position might be to agree to some boundaries. Maybe it's no discussion of sex or drugs or alcohol, if that makes sense for you. Then you have to pull the sponsor message out of episodes that include that stuff and obviously give them a credit for that segment. Podcasts should have a right to approve the ad content that runs in the show. You don't want your show associated with messages that your audience might find offensive or inappropriate, or that just you don't feel comfortable reading if it's a host read. You might also want to consider how the advertiser is going to measure success of the campaign. Who's going to share what data? Is data going to be generated? And if so, how do you get access to it? You're going to provide short links to their sales pages, or your customer's going to use a promo code. Whoever's doing the measurement should share it with the other party from time to time, because it can affect the pricing of ads later on. You need to cross-license the use of brands and trademarks for the ads and the sponsor, right? The sponsor wants to be able to say, as heard of on show title here. And you want to be able to mention the brand in your podcast promotional materials as well. Obviously, the warranties, the promises about not infringing other people's rights and indemnification, the promise to cover the other party's costs, the hold harmless stuff. And maybe your sponsor is going to want some assurances that they're not going to run against, right adjacent to an ad for a competitor, for example. So exclusivity might be a factor. This can get tricky, depends on the size of the commitment and the money and so on. You do sometimes see brands competing brands advertising on the same show, but the ad's generally not in the same break. This is a point for negotiation. And then you got to get into the remedies. What happens if there's a mistake? What happens if the ad doesn't run when it's supposed to, or there's something gets misread, or some other kind of mix-up? Usually we do something called a make good, where you don't want to have to return money paid out for the missing ad. You just want to give them another ad in exchange. You give the sponsor a replacement of equal or greater value, and you're good to go. So the real key to monetizing your podcast is that you have to know who your customers are. Some of you, that'll be the same as your audience. For others, it'll be brands and businesses who want access to your audience. You've got to know what you're selling, have a clear understanding of what you're selling. For many, it's audience earballs, as I like to say. If you're selling products, then it's the product, if you're an affiliate or if it's your own product. If it's services, your services, again, it's that indirect selling, right? This is where the attracting the audience comes in. Except with those premium and subscription models, your content really isn't the product. It's the bait that attracts the audience to hear about the product. So the quality of your audience and suitability to the sponsor's needs, even if you're the sponsor, is the product. And the size of the audience is the product. Knowing your product's value, you have to have a clear picture of what you're selling and the value. Value is not the same as price. What your sponsor gains from advertising on your show can be many things. It can be lead generation, it can be direct sales, brand recognition. Your product's value to your customer is what's important in setting prices. So you want to structure the offers that you make accordingly and define your terms carefully. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to get things in a contract. It doesn't have to be a very complicated contract, but it needs to be there. Here's an example. Say you refer to each episode of your show as a podcast, but the sponsor thinks of podcast as meaning all the episodes under that title. You got a terminology conflict here, right? So you put out 50 episodes a year, and they're supposed to pay you $1,000 per podcast. That's what it said in the quick email you fired off. So what happens? They think they're paying $1,000 for the year, and you're thinking you're getting $50,000. Now, you might be thinking this is crazy. How could that ever happen? I'm here to tell you it does. That exact scenario has arisen for 2 different podcaster clients of mine in the past few years. They've had to hire me to work out the situation, and it could easily have been avoided by using more precise language. Other terms that could be open to misinterpretation, things like season or show or spot or ad or campaign. So, to be as precise as possible is really important, so there can be no misunderstandings. Get it in writing, please. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I see podcasters make is monetizing or trying to monetize before they're really ready. I'm not talking about ready in terms of having the production process figured out or having a big enough audience, though that is an important component. I'm talking about not being ready in terms of not being set up, not approaching their podcasting with professionalism. Now, how many successful folks do you know that don't treat things in their success like a business? How many amateurs or hobbyists do you regularly give your money to? That's right, hobbyists, dabblers, make content, and they may have fans, but professionals have sustainability. They have customers, they have clients, they have businesses. They make content, and they make products, services, and they make money. Even if it's only a side hustle or a hobby for you, money coming in makes it easier and more fun. Am I right? Here's the bottom line. After practicing entertainment law and media law for nearly 30 years, I say with absolute certainty, advertisers, sponsors, networks, and platforms don't want to do business with amateurs and hobbyists. And when they do sometimes make those kinds of deals, the first step in everything is getting the legal and business affairs in order. So we're back to my takeaway premise. Whether you're in it as a hobby, as a side hustle, or as your main gig, getting your business and legal affairs in order is the best way to feel confident and secure so you can grow and monetize and supercharge your podcasting operation for big success. And until you do, those risks you get taken advantage of, you lose money on or control of your podcast and business, you miss out on opportunities, you spend too much money maybe, and you stay stuck where you are right now, hoping for that magic pill instead of playing the big game. So that is it. That wraps up the slides for today. Come back to my camera shot. There we are. I would love to know what you have going on in your head now. What are your big takeaways? I know it's a bunch of knowledge that came at you today. What are your questions? What are your takeaways? I'm going to come back. I know I had a couple of questions earlier on. Let me see. Rob says, I've noticed many media personalities seem to use their name as a part of a separate legal entity. That is, it might be the Rob Bear, the person. However, the podcast might be produced by Rob Bear Media, LLC. Any comments on using your name in an LLC? I think it's great. I think if you don't have a reason for choosing a different name, and that reason might just be whimsy, to be honest, go for it. Use your name. If you want to kind of maintain some distance and separation, maybe that's okay too. Certainly if it's the Rob Bear Show starring Rob Bear, brought to you by Rob Bear Media, somebody does come at you and feel that you've done them wrong somehow, they know that they're going to sue Rob Bear as well as the company. So that's a factor. But maybe a little separation makes sense. It's sort of up to you. A lot of people, it's a vanity thing. But when you are the brand, be the company name as well, right? Rob also asked, if the podcast channel expands to include others, would I be smart to form my own individual LLC to interact with my podcast LLC? That is, would it benefit from having the isolation of an LLC focused on me as an individual? Rob, this is starting to get into some complicated legal and tax scenarios. The short answer is there might be a reason to do that, but I wouldn't say the cost outweighs the benefit outweighs the cost for everybody every time. If you are expanding your channel to include other shows, don't use your name for the company name. Maybe that's a factor. Create the company like a network or whatever, and having keeping your own things separate might make sense. But really, if your channel is owned 100% solely by you, if you're not bringing other people in, then I don't see any reason necessarily to have a separate entity just for your personal services. There can be reasons to do that. We call them loan-out companies in the entertainment industry. When you're getting into the mid six figures in revenue is when I would say you might see some tax benefits to this. So, let's talk to your tax advisors about that as well. But no, as long as you don't have other members in the LLC that you don't want owning your stuff, then I think there's not a big reason for that. Thank you, Will, for posting the symbol information in the Facebook chat. I haven't looked at the YouTube in a while. Let me see if there's comments going on in here. Yeah, I've got a bunch of people. Diana asked, can I add my podcast DBA to an existing LLC, or do I have to open another LLC? Good question, Diana. It might be a little fact specific. You probably could transfer ownership of the DBA to the LLC, maybe as part of your the consideration you essentially pay when you capitalize that LLC. I guess that if you have that existing LLC, it could be part of your buy-in. It could also actually be a part of the LLC, and you just don't know it, depending on the timing of. If you form the DBA after the LLC, it might be considered the LLC actually is its owner. But it certainly makes sense to assign ownership, transfer the ownership into the LLC. It'll probably mean filing a new DBA, canceling the old one and filing a new one, because now the owner of the DBA or the user of the DBA is a different entity. And the DBA is a fictitious business name statement that's filed with the government so people know who's responsible for what's going on back there. Julie, thank you for answering that question as well. You want the new podcast to be part of an existing LLC. Should I put the podcast title as a DBA under the LLC? Not a bad idea. That's a good way to go. Diana, sister in France had a trademark infringement. She had to sue the guy who used her brand she had built for 20 years, and she won. He had to take down his business. That's exactly right. That's what goes on here. So I'm just scrolling up, Diana. No whammies. Good one. Looking back here, Jennifer asked, curious how value for value fits into this. Still considered a donation? No, value for value is a sales transaction. That means it's going to be income on the recipient side of the equation. Now, you don't want to talk to tax specialists. I am not a tax guy, but value for value is a sales transaction, essentially. So even if you're doing crowdfunding, value for value is a sales transaction. If you're doing Patreon, you're you're receiving money it's a subscription in exchange for some value. So that's income to you, expense to the buyer, if they have a legitimate way to write off that expense as related to their business or something like that. So I hope that answers that question, Jennifer. Will, on your link, I see option 2 relates to those symbols. Yeah. I actually have little fast links set up for those kinds of things. So, any other questions? I'm here for a few more minutes. Good long session today. I'm happy about that. I had a lot of content to drop on you. I hope it's been good knowledge bombs and valuable information for you. I know some people, I know Karen, you said you were stressed out, maybe a little intimidated by all this. I hope that you understand that doing these things isn't hard. There's a lot of steps. There's some complexity to it, but it's not hard. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about next time on Thursday is a little bit more about how you can do these things yourself. You don't have to hire me for every single step of it. I'm happy to do it for you if that's the way you like to do things. If you are more of a do-it-yourselfer, I've got the tools for you. Lots of legit professionals do a lot of this stuff for themselves in that early bootstrap phase. And that's what I'm here to help you with, is to show you how you can do that. So next time, we'll be talking a little bit about what it looks like, what real professionalism looks like, both from the inside and the outside. And I'll be sharing with you some strategies and some resources that will help you get these things done yourself, if that's the way you're so inclined. But it's if you can do what podcasters do, if you can set up a podcast feed and show notes and record an episode, this is easy. This is not beyond you. It's just a matter of having the right checklist so you can walk through the steps. And I'm going to help you with that. So hope that helps. Hope that alleviates some of your worries and concerns. I'm here for a bit longer. Let's have questions. I love to do this. Anybody need any coaching? Ken, thank you for contributing and sharing your knowledge. Nice to see you, Ken. That's not a question, but it's a wonderful little bit of praise, or a little thanks anyway. I'll take it as praise. I need all the praise I can get some days. And just a heads up, we're going to be back with session 3 on Thursday, but it's going to be at a different time of day. It's going to be at 9 a.m. Pacific time, because I have to teach a class Thursday at noon, and I need to give myself a little downtime in between. So Thursday, 9 a.m. Pacific time, that's noon Eastern. I think that's 1 p.m. GMT, if I'm correct. I may be wrong. But I hope you can join me Thursday for session 3. I've forgotten the title of session 3 right off the top of my head. I think it's What Professionalism Looks Like. Let me head on over to the page where it is. Session 3, what legit professional success really looks like. And by the way, some of you out there, I consider legit professional successes. If you would like to tell me what it looks like to you, and even if you aren't yet where you consider professionally successful as a legit podcaster, share what that would look like in the notes. I would love to hear in the comments on Facebook and the comments on YouTube, what do you view legit successful professional podcast meaning? What does legit success look like? And I'll share some of that when we talk on Thursday. So that's it. It is now just about half past the hour. I'm going to play a little music on the way out. Oh, somebody had a question. Hold on. Jennifer, I have a client who's in the prep stages of developing her show. I'd like to connect you with her. We'll send a message. Jennifer, that's great. Absolutely. Please do connect her. You can just make an introduction with my email address if you have it. If not, send me hers, or however you want to do it. And send me a message and we'll make that happen. I appreciate it. And also turn her on to what we're doing here. She can catch up if she wants to register. I'm going to give you the link again, just so you know. It's my name, GordonFiremark.com. Whoops. It's not working. GordonFiremark.com/getlegit. Oops. I can't believe I did that. And it's not going to let me edit it either. Oops. All right. Well, it's Get Legit, not no T there. There we go. Get the T in there. Edit. Get Legit. There we go. Nope, didn't work. Rats. All right. Well, anyway, gordonfiremark.com/getlegit. I will get it fixed in here. There it is. Now it's working. The link is there. She can sign up for that and follow along with us. She can catch up on the first 2 sessions and join in Thursday for the third one, and with what follows that may be very valuable to her as well. But a direct contact would be wonderful as well. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to everybody for being here. And until next time, keep on podcasting. Let's get that good content out and do our thing. All right. Thanks for being here. Can't find my screen. There we go. Go back to this.
What's your story? What's your sign? It's like we're twin flames in a different life. Deep connection lights a spark. It's like you know me in the depths of my heart. We're dreamers. Don't care what other people say.
All right, everybody, take care. See you soon.